Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Childcare Business Podcast. My name is Leah Woodbury. I'm the head of content here at ProCare Solutions, and we are so happy to have all of you join us today. And we're thrilled to have on this episode Jaime Rechkemmer. She's a founder of Aim4Impact Consulting. So her work includes helping childcare centers with QRIS, compliance, professional development, curriculum assessments, technology. It's a lot, everything in between. Jaime has worked at some of the largest childcare organizations in the country, and she chairs the AI and Machine Learning Advisory Board at Watch Me Grow. Jaime, welcome. We're so glad you're joining us today.
Thank you, Leah. Thank you so much for having me.
And today we're going to be talking about something that a lot of childcare centers are worrying about or want to know how they improve, and that is building loyalty and how centers can better do family retention in their ECE programs, in their daycares. And this is something that Jaime has some expertise on. And before we get started on that, we always like to start these conversations by getting a little background on our guests. Jaime, I'm wondering if you could tell us how you became involved in ECE and chose it as your career path.
Absolutely. I am an ECE lifer. I
You
started
are.
working, yes, in an early education program when I was in high school. I chose early education as my undergraduate degree, and so worked in a childcare program all through college. And then, my first big girl job was as a preschool teacher for one of our national childcare brands. And from there, my career has taken a lot of different twists and turns. So I have been a childcare director. I've written curriculum for early education. I've worked in early ed nonprofit. But for most of my career, I was an executive in early education for, like you said, some of the large companies. And my area of the business was always related to kids and families and teachers and quality. And so the topic of family engagement and family loyalty and family retention, super important to me because all of the areas of the operations that I focused on were the ones that hopefully contributed to that family loyalty being established.
Yeah. So let's shift to today and let's focus on how our listeners can keep those families happy. So we here at ProCare Solutions, we do an annual report every year on childcare business trends. And one interesting stat from this year was that about 40% of the respondents to the survey that we used to write the report, they said they're facing challenges with maintaining consistent enrollment. And I'm curious if you can kind of use your expertise to tell us, like, what are the reasons that so many centers are struggling with enrollment right now?
I think that, probably we would all agree that one of the largest factors in enrollment challenges today is consistent staffing. And so you can't have a conversation about family retention and family loyalty without having a conversation about staff retention and staff loyalty.
Right.
Um, but also, having gone through the pandemic, families were forced very quickly to figure out other solutions, things that they may not have considered. At the same time, employers became much more compassionate and thoughtful and listened more about the challenges that families had finding childcare. And so I think that there have been some really creative solutions that families have been able to find. Um, we find childcare in a lot of settings outside of the traditional childcare program. We've got pre-K, we've got Head Start, we've got early Head Start, you've got nonprofit, faith-based, family. There's just so many options for
Yeah.
families to choose. And I think families are a lot more discriminating in looking for not just programs that are affordable, but programs that really represent the values of their families. And so they're looking more deeply into the choices. Uh, so I think there's a lot of different reasons.
Yeah. And it does seem like there's a lot of focus maybe on growing enrollment, but not as much on making sure current families are happy and that they're not looking not maybe looking down the street or elsewhere. Why do you think that is, that that focus is so different when it is so important to retain those families?
I have a couple of ideas. One,
Okay.
I when I think of acquisition of families, I think of that as being a task of an administrator. That's the front office, it's the director, it's the person who's greeting the family in the door. It's the owner, it's the operator, right? It's the acquisition of the family is up at the front of the house, whereas the retention of families is really at the back of the house. It's the teachers, it's the experience that the families are having in the classroom, it's the children's, you know, joy of walking in the door and running to their teacher and having a great day. But
Hmm.
but really, I mean, if we get down to it, who's probably listening to this conversation? It's the administrators. We talk about enrollment in families with the administrators, but it's really the teachers that play such a pivotal role in establishing family culture and family loyalty and family retention. So I think, part of this conversation starts with who's at the table when we're putting together strategies for family retention. Um,
Hmm.
I think that also when it comes to retaining a family, when it comes to creating family loyalty, that is all about culture and all about experience and all about connection, and it's happening every single day. And
Yeah.
sometimes you don't realize that there's a breakdown in those things until it's already broken. And so you're scrambling to repair something rather than proactively really making it strong day after day after day. And I think that, there's a lot to be said for once a family loses trust in their child care provider, it's really tough to gain it back. And so it could be under those circumstances that the real energy expended to acquire a new family seems to be the right energy. But I think we would all agree, absolutely not. It costs so much more to acquire a new family. It's so much harder on the child and the family and the child care provider and the teacher to see this churn of families. It changes, everything about the classroom experience and the classroom environment. And so really focusing on retention of families and creating a culture where they feel welcomed and where they feel like they belong is one of the best investments you can make in your business.
Well, I was just thinking as getting ready for this podcast, my youngest just wrapped up preschool like a year ago, and the number of times that I talked to his teachers compared to the director, I mean, it was 10 to 1 that,
Yeah,
I was talking to the teachers
sure.
versus, yeah, somebody in an office. And I think that sometimes does get lost. So I'm really glad you brought that up.
Yep.
And I'm also curious how the expectations of today's families differ than families of maybe 10 years ago, 5 years ago, whatever metric you think is a good one for
Sure.
comparison.
I think that our world has changed so much, in the past 5 years that I'm not
Yeah.
sure looking back a decade ago would give us much more than historical insight. But I think that we can definitely talk about ways that families have changed their expectation. I remember, when we used to think about affordability, when we used to think about convenience, when we used to think about word of mouth referrals, and when, if your neighbor or your colleague or your best friend was a family in the child care program, then that was a great place for you to be. So much has changed about our communities to start with, that for me, one of the things that has changed is how much families put weight on the connection that they establish with their childcare program. And it starts with that very first visit. It starts with every interaction, that they have in that first week or that first 30 days. And families are really wanting to feel rooted and grounded in this place where they drop their child off every day. And so, whereas cost might have been and still is of tremendous importance, it's not the only consideration. as it relates to cost too, I think that families are certainly much more in tune with the value of their investment. So it's not just whether or not they can afford it, but it's whether or not they feel like they're getting everything that you promised them when you walk through the door, right?
Mhm.
And so we give a great tour and we talk about all of the wonderful things about our program. But our parents are expecting to see it and feel it every single day. And so when they don't, it's not about whether I can afford it, it's about whether or not this is the right place to be putting my dollars in care for my children, right?
Right.
And then, I think that we have to talk about, you know, health, safety, sanitation, all critically important. But our families, today's parents, are much more informed about what quality early education looks like. We have quality rated improvement in so many states, and those states have big campaigns where they teach our families what do we look for in quality care. Childcare is in the media often, and there is often a lot of um, positive stories about the impact of early education as we're advocating for more funding and all of those types of things. And
Mhm.
so parents know what to look for, and so the quality, the communication, and the cost, I think are three things that are just at the top of the list for families. Whereas there was a time where it may have been a little different than that.
Right. So let's talk about the reasons that families do make that decision to leave a child care center. And you found the biggest factors are concerns about quality of care, communication gaps between staff and families, and cost-related issues like
Mhm.
we just talked about. So I wonder if we can break down each one and maybe start with quality of care.
Sure. Quality is where my heart is. That's,
Mhm.
in each of my roles across early education, quality has always been a benchmark of what I hoped to deliver and what my team, is really looking for. As I mentioned, most of our states have QRIS programs that kind of define quality benchmarks for us. But certainly we're talking about, really rich, developmentally appropriate environments that are full of lots of great toys. One of my favorite mentors ever, used to talk about the toy store effect and how when a child or a family member walks into a classroom, you really want them to take a breath at just how magical that space is, the same way that they would take a breath if they walked into their favorite toy store,
Mhm.
because play is how we teach and play is how children learn. And so you want that sense stepping through the door that this is a magical playground with everything that we might ever want to do inside. And also that all the people in the room are lots of fun to play with too. So, those interactions between children and teachers and those interactions between children and each other. You talked about your benchmark survey, and I remember a survey that I read once, and I don't recall, who the author of the survey was, but it was asking parents, what is your biggest worry? When you go to bed at night, what is your biggest worry? And it was that their child is liked, that their child has friends. And so that's one of the things that we promise families in our early education programs is we promise that your kid's going to have such a great time and they're going to make so many friends. And so really showcasing the interactions between teachers and children and children and children. Another, element of quality, and then certainly the curriculum that any program chooses. And there are lots of great curriculums out there, and there are even more really talented teachers who build curriculum as children's interests emerge and day by day by day. But knowing developmentally appropriate practice and celebrating milestones and having really rich experience for kids, those are all things that parents look for. One of the difficulties, though, Leah, is that they can't always see it, right? They're not there all day long.
Right.
So we
Right.
have quality benchmarks, but we don't have a really great way of making sure that families see those quality benchmarks. And so the kind of segue into communication is we got to have a great methodology for how we share those moments. And it might be video streaming cameras. It could be, digital platforms where we send photos and notes about daily routines. But hopefully
Mhm.
it's also those conversations that you said you had with your child in preschool, 10 to
Yeah.
1, right? Every
Yeah.
day we should have
Yeah.
something really great to celebrate about kids.
Yeah. Yeah. Where do you think those communication gaps start? Is it just that teachers are so busy? Is it that families maybe don't
That's
know
a
the right
really good
questions to
question.
ask? Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It's a tough one,
So
I think.
it's a really great question. I think it starts, unfortunately, right now, it starts with our just tremendous teacher turnover in early education. Um, there isn't enough time to really form a trusting relationship, and it's not just there's not enough time in the day, there aren't enough days because teachers, unfortunately, come and go, but frankly, so do families. We were talking about enrollment and retention, and one of the, consequences of family retention rates that are low is that you have that churn of families, and so you don't get to establish this great communication cadence. I think another, really important thing to bring to the table is that kind of dynamic between families and teachers. And in my best experiences, there is not a hierarchy there whatsoever at all. It is totally and completely a partnership. And families are teachers and teachers are family. And we are both here in order to like provide the best for kids. And to do that, we have to talk to one another and trust one another and accept one another's strengths, but also really build each other's opportunities up, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but all of that does take time, and most of our family relationships exist, between 7 and 8 a.m. and between 5 and 6 p.m. And everybody comes at the same time. And you're either really busy to get to work or you're really, really tired from work and you want to go home. Like, there's just not a lot of really quality opportunities to engage in great communication with families. And so we have to be intentional as operators, as directors, as teachers, we have to be intentional. But I think we also have to really make it clear to our families that we need them to be intentional as well, right? We need
Yes.
them to really want to get to know us and want to be part of this wonderful experience that we're making for their child.
Yes. Yes. It's because it is true, and everybody's always picking up at the same time or dropping off at the same time. It felt like it was never staggered
Yeah.
either at those
Well,
busy
and
times of day.
as you mentioned that as a parent coming in, there were probably also a lot of days that you didn't see the same teacher in the morning and in the afternoon because,
Hmm.
we forget that we are trying to staff, sometimes a 12 or 14-hour day with traditional working hours. And that doesn't always line up very well. And then because we've got such tremendous responsibilities to ratios and group sizes and things like that, those very early morning hours and those late afternoon hours, sometimes there is a lot of movement, whether classroom movement or teacher movement or kid movement, whatever it might be. There's a lot of moving parts to make it all work for everyone.
Yeah.
And so, as much as we rely on the in-person communication and how critical that is for connection, which our families are looking for, we also need to be very intentional about our digital processes, whatever they might be, very consistently sending home the same information day after day so that parents reliably get those tidbits that they're looking for. And then being sure too, as teachers, that we make a commitment to communicate with one another about the families. If you're gonna see one of the little families, in the afternoon and I was there in the morning, you need to know what I saw in the morning so that you can share that information with them so that there's no gap in understanding because of the time of drop off and pick up and our work schedules and things like that.
Yeah. All right, let's go to the third one. Cost related issues. How's that affecting loyalty? Our pocketbooks, the pocketbooks of
Um,
Suners, all of them.
well, you know what? Like the cost conversation, there's so many stakeholders, right? Like
Yeah.
there's the cost of actual quality, like what does it really cost to deliver what children and families deserve in early education? There
Hmm.
is the cost or rather the expense that families can truly afford. And then there is kind of that more maybe ethereal idea of is this expense worth it? Am I getting am I is it worth it not just in am I getting value and good stuff for my kiddos, but also the things that I have to do to earn the money for this service, the transportation that I have to pay for to get back and forth from this service for my child. Like, there's just so many parts to it, right? Like, we could have hours and hours and hours of conversation just on cost. But I think
Right,
when it comes to family loyalty, families, when they enroll in your program, they know what the cost is, right? It's their responsibility to make sure it fits their budget. And it's also your responsibility as an owner operator to make sure that family knows that just like any other expense, when your costs go up, so will your tuition, right? So that there's not this unrealistic expectation that from 0 to 5, I'm going to have the same expense related to early education. But I think that once the enrollment takes place, then the retention and the loyalty comes. And what I mentioned before is do families see everything that you promised for their child every day, right? And so I oftentimes will coach owners and operators and directors, give me a tour and let me make notes on all the things that you promised me as a potential parent. And then for the next couple of days, I'm going to look for all of those things in your program. I'm going to start by looking for those things from 7 to 8 in the morning and 5 to 6 in the afternoon, because that's when I'm in your building. How much of what you promised me do I see during those times? Then I'm going to look for all those things throughout the day, and I'm going to ask questions about how are you ensuring that mom and dad see this learning experience? How are you ensuring that mom and dad know that soccer shots happen? How are you ensuring that mom and dad see the sign language that you're using in the infant room? And at that point we start talking with teachers about how intentional they are about those things that were promised. And Leah, sometimes I find out that the teacher's not even necessarily aware of all the things that were talked about in the tour. So they aren't even 100% sure exactly what they're supposed to be doing, much less how they do it in such a high quality way that it shines even when parents aren't around. Like I mean, that's a tough order. So, from a retention perspective, cost is really about reframing to value, and to making sure that families see what they're getting, making sure they know not just what what you are charging them for tuition, but also knowing what you're investing those dollars in, right? You're
hmm,
investing it in your staff. And so you've got staff qualifications and staff, continuing education. You're investing it in safe facilities. And so share with parents when you upgrade security systems, when you install new ACs, when you have a tune-up on the bus, because then they see their dollars at work, right? Um,
right.
if you have differentiators like soccer or Spanish or technology or dance, like those kinds of things, they're happening, but our families noticing that they're happening. And so how do you really make those shine as well? It's really all about making your families not just hear you say that it's worth their investment, but that they feel it and they know it and they're part of it.
Well, and that's a great segue. You beat me to my next question is what what center owners and leaders should do to keep those current families happy. And yeah, that's seeing that they're getting what they pay for and that their children are happy. And I think that's huge. But what else should they be doing?
So I heard a quote the other day, and it was, let me say, connection is the currency for loyalty. So connection is the currency for loyalty. So how we are able to connect with people is kind of the dividend that we get in return is their loyalty, their retention, their commitment, those types of things. All about connection and relationships. And
Yeah.
so I think that we have to start with how do we form those relationships with families? And again, we talk a lot in early education about how we form relationships with kids. There are tools that measure how successful we are in our interactions with our children. I think to other agencies, I'm sorry, to other industries, and how often other industries, for example, have a net promoter score, right? Would you recommend us? And why? What is it about your experience that's so positive? Or they do customer service training or customer service, surveys because we have a really, really hard job to serve kids, to serve families, and to serve teachers. Three very specific stakeholders with very unique needs. And so definitely want to focus on that relationship that we build with families so that they feel seen, they feel heard, they're valued every single day. And
Mhm.
remember that it's the day that it doesn't happen that families will remember, right? So we
Yeah.
could have a full calendar of getting it right, and then that one day that there's a misstep or a missed opportunity to connect with a family, that's the one that's going to stick with them. So being very consistent. I really recommend an onboarding for families, the same way that we onboard staff. We might have, a one day of really intentional onboarding, then we have 5 days of experiences. We do a check-in, we make a phone call, right? Like those kinds of things are really important to families too. And so having a plan for family onboarding, making sure that there are multiple touch points for the first 30 days, but also that it's not just the director, right? That it's the
Yeah.
director, it's the teacher, your cook, your bus driver, any adult who is going to be involved with a child should, in those first 30 days, make a really intentional effort to introduce themselves, to tell the family a story about how they interacted with their child and started
Mhm.
building that friendship. Like those are the core memories that are going to make everything better when you miss an opportunity to connect down the road, right? Um, I think personalizing the experience, Leah, making sure that not just the child's name, but that mom and dad's name, that something about that family and what's important to them, and not just where they work and when they pay their bill, but like things that are interesting to them. And I remember in my role across multiple childcare centers, I would visit our facilities, which means I didn't have those relationships. I didn't know families by name. I didn't know children by name, and they didn't know me. Now, the kids would always run up and ask, "Who are you? And are you somebody's mommy? And where do you live?" Like they would want to know a lot
Yeah.
about me. Families would be very suspect of me, right? Why are you here? Are you monitoring something? Are you with the state? They'd ask those kinds of questions. And so I just really took it upon myself to always introduce myself to any adult that I came across, no matter who they were, and let them know who I was and why I was there, and that I was, really, really interested in their kids' quality experience. But what that showed, even years later, right? Because they recognized or they remembered me because I made an effort. So if I was in that program a year later and they were in that program a year later, chances are that family would remember me. And that always made me feel like I'd done something right in that first
Mhm.
introduction. Um, Two
Exactly.
more things come to mind. One, like really special moments for families, wow moments for the families. If you know that something really cool happened, if there was a promotion, if they're having a family vacation, if grandparents are in town, if they got yard of the month in the neighborhood club, those kinds
Yeah.
of things that you just hear in the hallways. Remember them and celebrate them. Or even just sending thank you notes, check-in calls, how are things going? Those mean a lot. And then the last thing that comes to mind is really authentically asking families for feedback. So I said, partnerships are really important and families need to feel like they're part of their child's learning experience. And that means you've got to ask them, not just for the Google review, but also you've got to ask them, how are things going and what could we do better and where are we missing the mark and where are we getting it right, and so that we can keep doing those things. But really asking for feedback, um, because I think that families who feel seen, and who feel heard and who feel valued, those are the families that stay through thick and thin, and that's what you really need.
Absolutely. Well, those are all the questions I have. Did I not ask you something I should have, or is there anything left hanging that you think our listeners might want to know
Oh man,
about
that's
building
always
loyalty? Any
yeah, you read that question about how at the end of the interview you should always, is there something I didn't
Yeah,
ask you that you would like to tell me?
yes, yes.
You know, I I think that I think maybe just not avoiding hard conversations, and I think that's a life lesson for us all in so many areas. And we talk about that a lot when it re comes to teacher retention, but family retention, not avoiding the hard conversations, but also don't miss the small signs that a family is on their way out the door. Um, and and some of the small signs, I think, one, when families go silent, I think that that's always an indication. If they were knocking on your door every day, all day long, either with praise or with problems, at least they were knocking. If they go silent, then you want to check in on them and find out what's going on. Um, and yeah, I think that's it. I think that's it.
That's a great way to end it. Like keeping those lines of communication open and being willing to hear the good, the bad, and the ugly,
That's
which
right.
hard conversations.
Yeah.
Jamie, thank you so much for
Thank
your time.
you.
We really appreciate it. Could you let our listeners know where folks can find out more about you, your work, and
Yes,
any
I would
other
love to do
info?
that. So
Yeah,
I have launched kind of an independent business, Aim for Impact, website aim4impact.org. And what that allows me to do is just take all of the many interests and experiences that I've had in early education and piece them into a job description. It's like the best, the best of the best opportunities. But right now, am most proud of some of the work that I'm doing with Watch Me Grow, a technology company in the ECE space. And there's some great information on their website about the Machine Learning Advisory Board and smart observations and the way that we're imagining using video to retain teachers. And we can have a whole nother conversation about how that video experience, the real life, real time nature of it, can be so valuable for our families as well. So either of those places, you can check me on my website or learn more about the work I'm doing at Watch Me Grow.
wonderful. Well, thank you again. Thank you to everybody who took the time to listen today. And thank you to everybody out there doing the important work that you're doing in ECE. And we know it's a hard job. We at ProCare Solutions are so glad to support you. And we'd like to say thank you as we always do. We hope you all have a great day and we will see you on our next episode. Bye, everybody.